Hey, before we start this, I just wanted to say that from now on, as often as I can, I will be promoting artists in these videos, and today it will be the artists Raiko Art, Jimmy Ling, and Ian Yanas. You can find contact information in the description, and other than that, I just hope you still enjoy the video.
6 magical gems for writing fantasy. We've all been there at one point or another. Someone, either a friend or ourselves, or maybe a creative enemy, has had us pull through the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy extended editions. Or maybe we just watched every Harry Potter movie back to back. Whatever the case, we have issues and need to get out more. But even more so, some of us will watch movies like that and think, hey, all that trolls and magic stuff is kind of cool. I should write some fantasy. So we go online and Google fantasy, and then we regret that we ever turned our adult filter off. No matter, because fantasy is a widely misunderstood genre of literature. Most simply toss it aside as fairy tales meant for children. Others think that fantasy just means writing a normal story or even a sci-fi story and making every technology a magic wand or sword. People seem to mostly think of the genre as being about big burly men with oversized magical swords and busty women in undersized armor, duking it out with or against dwarves, elves, trolls, and monsters. The last two are usually in the against pile, but variations do exist. Other common elements are dragons, both good and bad, the swords, often magical, ghosts, and the supernatural. And of course, cool fights, often with those magical swords against dragons or supernatural monsters. But while stories can definitely be written that way, the real key to much of the very successful fantasy stories is a different kind of mindset. A way to look at the world that is almost uniquely fantasy. So here are some magical little trinkets to get your fantasy story going and make it better than all those other amateurs. 1. Complexity is evil. At the core of most successful fantasy is the idea of a clear-cut villain, someone who really has it coming. The underlying thought is often that this is a very nice feeling because we know who has to be fought. But even deeper than that is the idea that we, as fantasy readers, don't really want to overthink things. And this goes beyond simply making it easy to know who or what is evil. It's the very idea of having to think that is the true evil. See, more than just not having to think, we want to feel good about not having to think. Does all that weird analysis bother you? Congratulations, you're probably fit for both reading and writing fantasy. Fantasy stories can have as much complexity as anything else. Don't let anyone tell you differently. But in fantasy, things that are complex work best as evil, or as greatly connected to evil things. It can be magic, politics, even the strange and confusing life of the forest, or religious or spiritual questions. Whatever it is, it's complicated, and that means that it should probably be feared and hated. And in a strange twist, some of the most impressive fantasy heroes are the ones who dare to get close to this evil without ever becoming a part of it. Think of the mighty armies, magic, and industry that the villains from Lord of the Rings are involved with, or how the greed of the dwarves made them create complicated mines to dig deeper. Would these things have worked if they had been simple? Probably not. The scope of it, and showing how complicated it all looked, was a great part of portraying it as evil. The same goes for the evil political schemes in Game of Thrones, or the bureaucratic ways wizard society is run in Harry Potter. If it grows beyond what you can plainly see and understand, it's probably evil. So to start off your fantasy story, even before you create the world around it, pick one or more things that you want to portray in great detail. Now, make them evil. Typically by having villains work for them, or with them, or by simply having bad things be spawned from them somehow. 2. Good is inside of you, all along. It's a painful cliche at this point to say that the power to defeat evil was inside a character all along. But writing a story isn't about what is going on, but how you describe it. And for fantasy, even though complexity is evil, simplicity is not automatically heroic. The villagers of the world may be simple and good, but they are not usually the ones to save the day. No, the real heroes have to embody something that is innately human, meaning something that can theoretically be found in all of us. In old fantasy stories, this had a habit of being physical strength, with a muscular hero using brute force to defeat the clever villain's complicated scheme. Hint, hint. Nowadays, it tends to be more about emotions, such as courage, kindness, loyalty, even humility, or other things that we love to see other people show for us. And this is not just something that the hero has all along, or something that suddenly turns up at the last second. At least it isn't if you want to have people praise the brilliance of your writing. The hero has it in him, or her, or them, all along, but it either starts out weak, or it gets badly broken along the way, or both. Most of the hardcore fantasy story is really just a story about how heroes realize that they must and can bring that emotion out in themselves. And this is such a strong concept that many other genres tend to swipe it and disguise it as their own, even if they avoid other fantasy cliches. But in fantasy, it's not just a part of the story, it often is the story. And tracking the state of such emotions in heroic characters can make or break a good fantasy story. So think of some good inner values, put them in your heroes somehow, and have them grow or be regained throughout the story. 3. Luck is very real. One problem that comes from complexity being evil and heroism being about emotions is that it's fairly difficult to describe how heroes become powerful enough to take down really big foes. But there is a powerful remnant inside of fantasy, which might date back to ancient Greek mythology, and that is the idea that luck, quite literally, favors the bold. Or more precisely, that being the hero and fighting to keep the aforementioned good vibrations strong inside of you makes you deserving of various kinds of luck. The idea that luck just drops in whenever it's needed has become less popular as readers get more experienced with fantasy stories. This is often called Deus Ex Machina, referring to an ancient Greek theatrical concept that really isn't important enough to retell here, but you can Google it. Deus Ex Machina is basically when the hero is in a bad situation and the solution just kind of pops out of nothing, requiring no real effort to obtain. This could be a magical sword that can slay a demon, and which just magically appears for no reason when the hero has to fight that demon. But if looked at more closely, almost all progress of a fantasy hero is Deus Ex Machina. The trick is to bury it so deep in the story that nobody will spot it for what it really is. This often means that the hero will come by something just because of luck, and it will be important to the plot later. But the key phrase here is later. The heroes may get something early on, for no real reason, which only much later turns out to somehow be a powerful tool to win. That magical sword might be a gift very early in the story, for no real reason, long before it lets the hero defeat the demon. So when you're plotting out your fantasy story, make sure that your heroes come across helpful things long before they are needed, and describe some reason they drop into their laps. 4. Everything is very big and confusing. While real complexity is in the hands of villainy, the world itself needs to be a wild and scary place too. The typical fantasy world is one of many small towns, a few big cities, and a lot of empty wilderness. This is because good is about the simple life, and the simple life means staying safely in your hometown. Okay, that might be simplifying it a bit, but remember that making things simple makes me a good person. Thinkers are the bad guys. The wilderness, often meaning forests or dangerous mountains and cliffs, or even freezing cold, is for fantasy what darkness is for horror. The place where you have no control over anything and therefore everything becomes an adventure. A lot of the time, however, the wilderness itself isn't that fitting to write about, simply because it's just wild and chaotic. Instead, the way the characters react to the wilderness becomes important, and vice versa. And unlike complexity, this is not just a threat to the heroes. It can be, but it might just as well be something that the villain fears, or something that causes problems for townsfolk in general. If part of the wilderness is controlled, the method for controlling it is usually what makes it good or bad. A clever and powerful method tends to make it complex and therefore evil, while someone pure or simply in spiritual harmony with nature can harness the chaos for the sake of good. Thinking of some kind of wild that people can get lost in and hurt by tends to make a fantasy world far stronger. It can be nature, but it can also be a wild and chaotic city, or even a war-torn land. It doesn't want anything, necessarily, from the heroes or villains, but it's chaotic and so widespread that it probably has to be dealt with in one way or another. Finding your kind of wilderness can be what makes your fantasy world stand out. 5. Fantasy is not the Middle Ages. Most fantasy is thought of as medieval. Knights and castles are often symbols of it, and many consider knights, castles, and then some magic to be the formula for fantasy. But the Middle Ages were simply a logical backdrop for fantasy, because everything was already isolated and people lived simple lives, often fearing anyone who had big and complicated ideas, and sometimes with good reason. But in fact, most of the ideas in fantasy come from ancient Greece, Rome, or Egypt, or even Arabic and Asian cultures. Fantasy can be set in any age or background, and many genres have the word fantasy added to them to create something new. Urban fantasy, for example, has humble and valiant heroes from the working classes or the like, deal with great conspiracies and power plays, with the wilderness being the more brutal parts of big city life and probably some monsters thrown in for good measure. Space fantasy, or sci-fi fantasy, has big empires fall before the hand of honest and spiritually enlightened farm boys, if you know what I mean. And although there is a genre called steampunk, a lot of the stories from it tend to be fantasy stories, just set in the age of steam. 6. Respect the silliness. This is easily lost when you write fantasy, knowing what you have been told here. It can easily seem that fantasy is, in fact, childish wish fulfillment and sloppy stories about heroes winning just based on luck. But there is a greater story running beneath it. The idea that heroes can be perfectly common people. And that is often the story that really needs to be told in fantasy. There is absolutely nothing wrong with trying to make fantasy heroes more complex, or truly earn their tools. but a lot of fantasy falls apart if this takes over completely. So, if you're serious about writing something for the classical fantasy market, even if you want to make it highly unusual, it's worth keeping the roots in mind, and maybe start with them when planning out your story. A complicated evil, some simple and emotionally strong heroes, isolated in a chaotic and threatening world, and some lucky breaks that come into play later, all of that can build a strong backbone for your fantasy story. And if you build that backbone, there is still plenty to flesh out on it afterwards.